Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some higher level principles with user interfaces. Conventions, especially industry standard conventions or operating system conventions or browser conventions, are the thing that you would want to think of when you think of consistency across uh, interfaces, not just one application, but across every possible interface your application may exist in. So you want to make sure that you understand what it means to be consistent with colors and symbols and navigation mechanisms on whichever operating system or browser platform your application is deployed. Generally, you want to favor operating system conventions over conventions within your own application or your own environment. So a good example of this was the original version of Microsoft Word, and actually still many versions of Microsoft Word on Mac OS systems that don't really follow conventions that you would typically see in a Mac OS environment. A good example of this would be if you do Option Backspace in a Mac OS environment, it doesn't eat the space in front of the word, it just destroys the entire word up to the first character of the word. But if you do Option Backspace in Microsoft Word, the convention in Windows is to not just delete the entire previous word, but also delete the space prior to the entire previous word. So differences like that can make a big difference in terms of how the system is actually used by the users. Another important piece of conventions is not related to operating systems or not related to the browser platform your application may be deployed on, but actually related to metaphor, the desktop metaphor being the best example. If you think of the desktop operating system environment, it's meant to evoke an actual physical desktop where you would have files sitting in certain locations, and there would be things that you could activate like lamp switches and so on a desktop environment. Another good example of a metaphor is the general notion of skeuomorphic design. That refers to using the physical appearance and affordances of some other object in the production of a digital application that replaces that object. So for a voice recorder, you might actually have a graphic that shows some sort of a tape winding or unwinding as the thing is recording or playing. And that's not necessary in terms of what the digital application does, but it does communicate to the user through the design of the application what the application is currently doing. It provides a context that helps the user understand how to navigate what's currently going on with the application. Okay, so these are high-level things that you would want to think about in terms of user interface design across applications. Another good example here of a high-level concern you would want to think about as you are going through many different applications over the course of your career is prototyping approaches to user interfaces. Again, this is not the same thing as the prototyping SDLC. You don't just build prototypes in the prototyping SDLC. The main difference is in the prototyping SDLC, you are building an entire application, a functional application. It may not be the final version, and in fact, it should not be the final version, but in reality, you're also building code and connecting things to the backend rather than just doing a user interface. For a user interface, you're just prototyping what the actual interface would look like. And this can be done in a wide variety of different ways and to a wide variety of different details. So you can do electronic storyboards with some basic functionality behind them, meaning when you click on a navigation button, it would show you the next screen, that sort of thing. That's maybe the most complicated version of prototyping a user interface. And there are specialty applications that help you build storyboards and prototypes in this fashion. A somewhat less sophisticated approach would be doing a mock-up, either in Photoshop or basic web frameworks, or even just a wireframe. These are possible, and they're actually kind of a nice middle ground between a full-fledged storyboard with application code that kind of connects things so that you can see how the actual navigation would flow, and just plain paper and pencil type mock-ups and wireframes. The trade-off, though, is really the key piece. When you're doing prototyping, there is a trade-off in the sophistication, the time that's required to develop the prototype versus the amount of effort that you're going to need to put into actually building the application. If you have tons of time, it's worth it to build prototypes and do user studies and bring in focus groups and have them evaluate interfaces. If you don't have tons of time, you may still be able to get away with something, even if it's just a very simple paper and pencil approach that would save you a lot of effort after the application is released and responded to user concerns. All right, so how do you evaluate an interface? This is another large concern that you would need to address over the course of many applications. Mainly, you're looking to evaluate in one of two scenarios. Either a scenario where you have an entire system and you're looking for navigation related issues going from one task to the next, or you're really just looking to evaluate the one really critically important task or the one really critically important screen your application has to deal with. User involvement is necessary to evaluate a user interface. It's very difficult to put aside all the tacit knowledge you have about the domain and about the development of the thing, all the decisions you made going into the design, to get a fair evaluation. So you really want to bring in users. And there's a couple of different ways you can do this. One can just be a very simple heuristic evaluation, a high-level overview of here's all the things that we were trying to do, what do you think? Another would be like a walkthrough where you walk the user through what's going on and then ask for their opinion on the sorts of things that the application is designed to do. And then the last one, the most complex one, is an actual interactive evaluation where the user is driving the application and you are sort of interacting with them, asking questions about things that they've seen. Now, these all are not really formal usability tests. These are all more like high-level evaluations to try and get a sense of where you're at. Typically, this sort of evaluation happens before formal usability testing, and I think it's a useful thing to do in order to make sure that your formal usability testing is very successful. I think of this as kind of like a pre-pilot evaluation of the interface where you bring in actual users and have them walk through parts of this either with you or on their own and then get some feedback prior to doing formal usability testing. All right, but you do need to do formal usability testing. Formal usability testing is going to happen in any application that you're doing user experience design for. And you really want to make sure that you do this with the focus on at least one of these features, right? You're either looking for the learning time, how big is the learning curve for the application, how quickly are they able to do things, how accurately are they able to do tasks, or you might be looking for something like the ability of the user to remember how the system works from one operation to the next, or their assessment of the look and feel of the system. You generally want to focus on one or maybe two of these elements at a time. It's difficult to pull off a formal usability test and get really good data on all of these at one go, especially for complicated applications, right? If you spend hours doing something with an application anyway, it's often very difficult to not only just go through one use of the system, but actually to get a good sense of how that system works from the perspective of time, speed, accuracy, memorability, that sort of thing. So formal usability testing is absolutely critical, but you generally need to be more focused than just looking at all of these at the same time. All right, and then navigation design. Navigation design is another thing that you're going to have to do across all the applications you design for user experiences. And the main thing that you want to do with navigation design is make it as consistent as possible. You want to prevent mistakes, simplify recovery, and make it very, very consistent across the use of the system so that whenever the user picks up the application, they never have to ask the question, how did I get here? What was going on here? You want everything to be absolutely obvious. Maybe the best example of this is for error boxes. Instead of just having labels like yes, no, or okay, put a context in there, right? Print or cancel, right? Something that sort of indicates what's happening when they click the button. Save or don't save, or save or delete, things like that where the actual action is sort of expressed in a clear label on the button that they're pressing. Navigation design is one of those things that, depending on the context the user is in, it could look really, really silly. So you never want to end up in a situation like this, right? You're at the elevator, you see two buttons, up, down, and then you see a third one, other options. Is there some other thing that you could do with this happens all the time with software. You see interfaces where there's a button or a feature or an affordance or something in the navigation design or in the layout that is totally nonsensical and could have been avoided had the user, had the user interface designer given a little bit more thought to how this user interface was actually going to play out in practice.